Hey, what's going on, APUSH people? We have Key Concept 7.2 for you today. This one is part of Period 7, which covers 1890 to 1945. This is the biggest time period, percentage-wise, of the new curriculum. So when you're done with this, we are 2/3 of the way done with Period 7. Before we begin, it's shout-out time. Time to give a huge shout-out to Coach Lachlan and Nighthawk. I appreciate the support. I understand you guys watch my videos often, so thank you much. It means a lot. All right, let's get started. The new curriculum 7.2 says, a revolution in communications and transportation technology helped to create a new mass culture and spread modern values and ideas. Even as cultural conflicts between groups increased under the pressure of migration, world wars, and economic distress. This is from page 67 of the curricular framework. So some big idea questions. How did technology transform the standard of living in the United States? What factors led to immigration restrictions during the 1920s? And what caused internal migration to increase drastically in the United States during the first half of the 20th century? All right, Key Concept 7.2 Roman numeral 1 says, new technologies led to social transformations that improved the standard of living for many while contributing to increased political and cultural conflicts. So let's look at letter A. New technologies increased the standard of living, improved mobility, and provided better communication. So some examples. We have the radio, which was a large source of entertainment during the early 1900s. Before the TV and computer, many people would gather around the radio and listen to different radio programs, including the War of the Worlds in 1938, which was a broadcast in which millions of people listened to that show. We also had fireside chats made popular during FDR's administration, in which he would give weekly radio addresses. And Father Charles Coughlin had the largest radio audience ever up until that point. Motion pictures were also popular during this time. They were known as Nickelodeons because they charged a nickel. And movies entertained many during the Great Depression. They were a very cheap source of entertainment. In 1927, we have The Jazz Singer, which was the first movie with sound. And automobiles played a very large role in the 1920s. This is where they became more and more accessible to Americans. And the mass production was popularized by Henry Ford. And this allowed for vacations or personal mobility and later the expansion of suburbs. The automobile really helped lead to increased travel in America in the 1920s. All right, let's talk about political and cultural conflicts that emerged over technological change, modernization, and changing demographics. There's lots of them. So these conflicts were evident in the following areas. Tradition versus innovation. Well, during the 1920s, we have less autonomy for many workers due to the introduction of scientific management in the assembly line. Do you know who this dude is? He is the creator of scientific management, also known as Taylorism, because his name is Frederick Taylor. Urban versus rural. For the first time in the 1920s, more people are living in cities than in rural areas, and more freedom and experiences were offered in cities than in rural areas, which could lead to some issues. Fundamental Christianity versus scientific modernism was a huge part of the 1920s. We have the Scopes trial, and on the left we have Clarence Darrow, who was the defense attorney, and the prosecutor, William Jennings Bryan, on the right. Here he is. He's much older, and he'll die about 6 days after the conclusion of this trial. And this really focused on the literal interpretation of the Bible versus teaching evolution in schools. So this was at the heart of this culture conflict in the 1920s. Continuing with this idea, we have management versus labor, and union membership decreased in the 1920s, and many unions were associated with radicalism. The Boston Police Department went on strike, and Calvin Coolidge stood up to them and gained popularity in the 1920s. Native-born versus new immigrants. Nativism in the 1920s increased drastically. I do have a video on nativism in the 1920s. Check that out below. The KKK, the second KKK, is popular during this time, and they are focused on anti-Catholic and anti-Jewish people as well as anti-black. And immigration quota acts of 1921 and 1924 were very restrictive. We'll talk about those in just a few minutes. And also, the Sacvan.jpg trial is a great example of this tension between native-born and new immigrants. Sacvan.jpg were immigrants from Italy. They were anarchists, they were atheists, they were draft dodgers, and their trial really focused on their character as individuals, not necessarily the crime itself that they were on trial for. There were issues between whites and blacks as well. You have the Great Migration, which we'll talk about again in just a minute, post-World War I. This was an African-American migration to northern cities, which led to the Red Summer, which were race riots in major northern cities, especially Chicago. And finally, we have idealism versus disillusionment. And the lost generation of the 1920s was a group of writers that really criticized middle-class values. And they will be similar to the Beat generation of the 1950s, which we'll talk about in period 8. All right, let's jump on over to the rise of African-American artists. We have specifically the Harlem Renaissance, which was a celebration of African-American culture through writing, music, and art. Famous people like Langston Hughes, and here is Langston, and Zora Neale Hurston. And national culture was also affected by art, cinema, and mass media. So some examples: Yiddish theater, which portrayed the experiences of American Jews and later influenced many English-speaking theaters in America. And you also have Edward Hopper, who was an artist that focused on the loneliness of the modern city. Key concept 7.2, Roman numeral 2 states the global ramifications of World War I and wartime patriotism and xenophobia, which is similar to nativism, it's fear of foreigners, combined with social tensions created by increased international migration, resulted in legislation restricting immigration from Asia and from Southern and Eastern Europe. And this is also from page 67. So World War I and civil liberties, let's just remember something really quickly. No matter what, during times of war and crisis, liberties typically decrease. Personal rights, personal freedoms typically go down. Now, during World War I, we see restrictions of freedom of speech, which were used against this guy, a socialist, Eugene Debs, who was arrested and sentenced to 10 years in prison and actually runs for president in 1920 from jail. The Sedition Act of 1918, you see the word sedition, think back to the Alien Sedition Acts of 1798. They restricted speech in the United States. And they were later, and the Sedition Act was later upheld by the Supreme Court in the court case Schenck versus the United States. I have a video for that as well in the description. I encourage you to check that out. All right, the first Red Scare is specifically mentioned in the new curriculum, so be familiar with it. This was caused in part by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917, and labor strikes in the United States after World War I were often associated with communism. So what were some effects of the Red Scare? Well, many radicals and immigrants were targeted, and they were specifically targeted during the Palmer Raids, in which thousands of immigrants and suspected communists were arrested. And they're called the Palmer Raids because they were led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, and here he is. Okay, acts of Congress that establish immigration quotas. There are two that you should be familiar with in the 1920s. The first is from 1921, or the Emergency Quota Act. And what this did was restricted immigration to 3% of a country's population in the United States, according to the 1910 census. So, if there were 100 Italian immigrants living in the United States in 1910, that means only 3 immigrants could come from Italy in 1921. Now, 3 years later, there's an even more restrictive, the National Origins Act, that is passed, and this further restricted immigration to 2% of a country's population in the U.S. Instead of that 3, it goes to 2, and they used the 1890 census instead, where there were less of those new immigrants. There were less of those people from Italy, Poland, and Southern and Eastern Europe. So this, in 1924, and here's Calvin Coolidge signing into law, this really targeted those new immigrants. Immigration from Latin America and Mexico remained unrestricted during this time, however. And the reason was the U.S. sought to have a cheap labor supply. All right, we'll finish up with key concept 7.2, Roman numeral 3, economic dislocations, social pressures, and the economic growth spurred by World Wars I and II led to a greater degree of migration within the United States, as well as migration to the United States from elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere. This is from page 68. So we have the Great Migration. I talked about it earlier. This is the movement of African Americans to the north that were escaping segregation and racial violence in the South. And you see here they're moving to cities like Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. So you see this in mass numbers. The first Great Migration happens after the First World War. When do you think the second one happens? Yeah, you know it. It's after the Second World War. And they search for new economic opportunities in northern cities during and after World War I, especially factory work in the north. Many factories provided jobs during the war, and sadly this did lead to racial violence in the north that's known as the Red Summer. And many still face discrimination in the north as well. Many Americans migrated within the country due to economic struggles. This happened during the Great Depression, most notably during the Dust Bowl. And here's a picture of a farmer and his 2 children. And notice how high the dirt and dust is. You can't even open that door. It's several feet high. Just the overcultivation of land during this time in the Great Plains. And many people who moved to California were known as Okies because quite a few of them came from Oklahoma. And this is really the message of John Steinbeck's book, The Grapes of Wrath. So that's one reason why people are moving. People are also moving during World War I and World War II for wartime production. There's this continual movement from rural areas to urban areas to work in factories. During World War II alone, 15 million Americans moved within the United States. That is a gigantic number. Many of them were moving to California, where there was a large war industry. New opportunities for women were available, including the iconic image of Rosie the Riveter, and here is a real-life Rosie from 1942. And they also worked in healthcare and other jobs during the wars. However, they were often paid less than men. Many Mexicans came to the U.S. for economic opportunities as well, and they faced ambivalent. This term ambivalent, I would be familiar with. It's a non-content term that you will be expected to know for your APUSH exam, and what it means is kind of having mixed feelings or contradictory, or being contradictory. So they faced contradictory government policies in the 1930s and the 1940s. Well, during the Great Depression, the government deported as many as 500,000 Mexicans back to Mexico because there's such a labor shortage during the Great Depression that more jobs were to be available for native-born Americans. Then during World War II in the 40s, we had the Bracero program, in which the U.S. encouraged Mexican immigration during World War II as a labor source. Specifically, many of these Braceros worked as farmers. So in the span of about 10 years, the U.S. government goes from deporting Mexicans to importing them to help out for labor during World War II. All right, we'll finish up with some test tips. Lots for the multiple choice of short answer questions. Be able to identify changes in technology, things like radio, the car, and the impacts. Identify and explain the causes of political and cultural conflict. The idea of urban versus rural, religion versus science. The Harlem Renaissance, absolutely positively know that. Be familiar with a couple people, whether it's LangstonHughes or other people. The Red Scare, this led to an increased scrutiny of immigrants and radicals. The Immigration Acts, be familiar with them and be able to connect it to nativism and specifically new immigration. The Great Migration, why were African Americans moving north and what were the impacts of that? For essay questions, this could be a part of a larger essay on migration opportunities, whether it's World War I and or World War II. Also, comparing the 1920s with the 1950s, we'll cover the 1950s in period 8, but the 20s and 50s have many similarities, and also different cultural conflicts between groups, whether it's immigrants, African Americans, women, you name it, that could be a possibility for an essay topic. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. I do appreciate it. I look forward to seeing you right back here for Key Concept 7.3, where we'll talk about this painting, which is at the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles Palace in France. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in this section below. I thank you very much for watching. Good luck on all of your tests, and have a good day.